Archiving started.
Welcome to Chapter 4, which covers the sources of American law. This is my favorite topic that we cover in the introductory course, and I hope that you'll also find it interesting. It's a combination of the study of law and also a lot of information about history. So if you find history interesting, you're likely to find this of interest. Another helpful aspect of this chapter is that for those of y'all that have attended American high schools or have already taken an American government course, you will find much of this information is probably already very familiar to you. So let's get started. Our legal system, just like our political system, grew out of the English system. Obviously, for hundreds of years, we were a colony of Great Britain, and so therefore the traditions that we began with when we became our own country had their seeds in the British system of government and the British system of law. There have been some adaptations and some changes over the time, but certainly the model that we use is most similar to the British model and is, I think, surprisingly similar to this day to what we see in Great Britain and other countries that were once part of the British Empire. So that's an important connection to draw when you're looking at, well, why do we do things this way? Most of the time the answer is going to be, well, that's because the British did it this way, or that there is some seed that we can find in the British system. We will find that many times we will refer to our system of law as a common law tradition. The background for the concept of common law is that it's case law driven. For the most part, there are kind of two categories of law. We've got statutes, which are typically written by the legislature and approved or enforced by the executive branch, which can be the king or it can be the governor or it can be the president. And then we have cases. These are judge-made law. These are decisions that judges render. And obviously you can have systems where you have a lot of statutes, and so this is really big, and where case law has very little importance. And you can have systems where case law is hugely important, and there's only a little bit of statutory effort or input. Back at the time of the American Revolution, certainly we were overwhelmingly a case law-driven country. There were statutes, of course. Certainly, if you think back to the Stamp Act or things like that really annoyed the colonists, and there certainly were statutes being passed. But the vast, vast majority of our legal tradition in the 1700s was case law-driven. Now, that balance has changed somewhat over time. Certainly, with a full-time legislature in the federal level and with a very active legislature in most states, we find that there's more and more statutes that are being developed. And so while the number of cases obviously continues to grow, the cases never shrink. The cases that exist in the past obviously continue to exist. And every year there's some more cases added, and then the next year there's some more cases added, et cetera, et cetera. But it's similar with statutes. There's more and more regulation. Obviously, 100 years ago, there were no rules about computer hacking, for example, and there would have been no need for automotive safety rules about car seats and things like that. But as the technology changes, as the culture changes, as values within the society change, we're going to find that those also cause there to be more legislation. So both of these categories are going to grow over time, but it's also true in our system, which is still a common law tradition, that some of the areas that were once addressed through cases are now being addressed through statutes. I'll give you an example. Back at the turn, we'll say it's 1700, there weren't a lot of criminal laws. There weren't a lot of criminal statutes. The judges had to make up the laws. Let's imagine that I was caught red-handed stealing one of my neighbor's goats. Well, let's say there was no statute that prohibited the stealing of goats. Well, that doesn't mean that the local people are going to be satisfied with me going about my business and therefore being available to steal their goats. They're going to be pretty unhappy about it, and they're going to go to the magistrate and say, hey, make Groover stop stealing goats. And the magistrate's going to say, well, there's no law about that. Well, the townspeople are going to say, well, figure something out. Figure out some way to punish her, to discourage other folks from stealing goats in the future. And so therefore the magistrate or the judge or whatever the title might be would come back and say, well, Groover, we have a law about not stealing chickens. And a goat is even more valuable than a chicken. So we usually put people in the jail for 3 months if they steal a chicken. You're stealing a goat, we're going to put you in jail for a whole year. And so that might be the way that the judge reconciles a development in the law. And so when I go to jail for a year because I stole the goat, then my next door neighbor who had been eyeing somebody else's goat stops and thinks, I don't think I want to go to jail for a whole year for stealing a goat, so maybe I'm just not going to pursue that path. So it had a deterrent effect upon the next potential goat stealer. And you can see how that was a necessary step when you had a legislature that was not particularly aggressive in coming up with statutes. You needed to have a plan B. You needed to have some organization that's going to fill in the gaps to make sure the needs of the local people were being addressed, were being satisfied. But nowadays, with a full-time professional legislature, they can anticipate these needs. They can say, hey, you know what? We already have a law that says you shouldn't steal chickens, but what if somebody steals a goat? Or what if they steal a sheep or a cow or a car or something else of value? How are we going to address that? And how are we going to separate the different categories from, stealing a piece of candy at the 5 and dime versus stealing going into a bank and robbing at gunpoint? There's levels of theft, and how are we going to address those issues? Well, in the area of criminal law, the legislatures have gone back and said, we know what the common law says about these topics, and it's not that we disagree with what the common law did, but you know what? We think it would be a good idea if instead of just having these cases, which are kind of clunky to work with, they're kind of hard to find, and the average person who perhaps is considering going astray doesn't have access, especially before the age of the Internet, doesn't have access to all these cases. But the statutes, if we organize it in a statutory form, they're pretty easy to find, and they're pretty available for folks who have an interest or a concern about the law to find. And it will also help remove ambiguity, because after all, if you have 20 different judges talking about a topic, none of them are going to perfectly agree. But if we have one answer, one statute that says this is what the rules are, it creates greater clarity. And so you can see how moving from case law tradition to statutory tradition is a good thing in many respects. It doesn't mean that we stop having cases. They continue to be important. Our system continues to be a common law system, but you can see the efficacy of codifying or making into statutes many of these ideas. I'm going to clear this up so it's not quite so cluttered. But that's not the only source of our law. We'll be talking a lot about the common law tradition. It's the most important part of our law, and it is also, I think most legal scholars would say, the most interesting, the most kind of historical and culturally driven part of our law. But it's not the only part. We also have constitutional law, and we have two categories for constitutional law. We have the U.S. Constitution, obviously, and that, of course, includes all the amendments to the Constitution. Then we have the state constitution. Texas, like most, perhaps all states, has its own constitution. And we'll talk about the role of the Constitution in this whole American legal system as we go forward. Then we'll talk about statutory law. There's lots of synonyms for statutory law. One is, we can just call it, it's what we think of when we use the term law usually. We're thinking about statutes. We're thinking about laws. And, of course, before a law becomes a law, we think of it as being a bill. Sometimes the word act is used. I use the example of the Stamp Act. That's another term for a law. And you can also use the term code. Many times you hear people say, well, we've codified that concept. It means we've put it into a code. A code is the same thing as a statute. But when people talk about codes, they are talking about a particular type of statute. An example would be the penal code. As you can probably surmise, the penal code are all of the laws about criminal issues. They're all organized thematically. You might have the family code. That's another code we have in Texas. And guess what? It's about things like marriage, divorce, child support, child custody, issues along adoption, issues along those lines, issues relating to the family. And then we might have a labor code, and that talks about all the issues about working conditions, working rights, things along those lines. You might have a tax code that would talk about tax issues. So you can see a code typically is going to have a word in front of it which tells you what the subject is. And it might be that in the penal code you have some laws that were written 100 or 200 years ago and some laws that were written yesterday. So they're not chronologically arranged. They're arranged within a theme. So imagine, for example, that we had a law against murder that we passed in Texas at the time that our state became a republic when it first left Mexico. And I'm sure at that point, very soon after that, we had a statute that prohibited murder. But over the passage of time, there have been changes to that law, additions, subtractions, alterations in the law. And what you're going to find, though, is all of the laws about murder are going to be in the same area, the very new parts, the very old parts. They're not chronologically arranged. So that's a little information about statutory law. Then, of course, we have executive orders. Let me go ahead and erase this. Oops. Did not mean to do that. Let me undo that. Well, maybe I can't undo that. Okay. Here we go. Back. Sorry about that. Okay. Executive orders are orders issued by an executive. In this case, we're talking about a government executive. So if we're talking about the presidential level, we'd be talking about, in the United States, of course, the president. In another country, that might be the prime minister or the king or the queen or the premier. There are other titles for that. When we're talking about it on a state level, of course, we're talking about the governor. That is the executive, the most high-ranking government official. And when he or she issues an order, that is called an executive order. It's different, though, than a law. When the Congress or when the state legislative branch issues or creates a law and it's signed by the executive, whoever that may be, then that's going to be a standard that applies throughout the country. But when the president issues an executive order, he can't force little old me in Frisco, Texas to follow that because he isn't the legislature. He doesn't have the capacity to create laws. But he can tell his subordinates what to do. So he can order the Department of Labor to do something different, or he can tell the Department of Defense to do something different. So he can affect that part of our country, the part that is the government. It works in a similar way that you can imagine if the CEO of Walmart were to implement a policy, say this Christmas. Let's say they were to have a policy that goes, we want all of our store greeters to wear green hats. And it's very important that every store has, at all times, at all the entrances to a Walmart, a greeter who is wearing a green hat. Well, that's not a law. If a store manager, Walmart store manager, chooses not to enforce that rule, that store manager isn't going to prison. But guess what? He might be fired because the Walmart CEO has the capacity to fire people who aren't following his rules. But let's go across the street to the Target store. The Target CEO had not issued any order that there be store greeters or that the store greeters wear a particular color hat. And so when that Target store manager decides, you know what, we're going to save some salary costs. We're not going to have greeters and they're not going to wear green hats. That Target store manager isn't violating any rules and isn't jeopardizing his job by making that decision. The Walmart CEO has no capacity or no power to force that Target store manager to do what he wants. So the executive power only extends to the area of responsibility that executive has. Now, of course, the president of a country, especially one as large as ours, has a lot of power. He can create a lot of facts on the ground. For example, there's a very famous executive order in the area of employment law that the president wasn't our current president, but a president in the 1960s issued, and that said, hey, employees of the federal government, you can't enter into a contract with a private company unless the private company agrees to have affirmative action programs for its employees. And so in that sense, even though the executive order only tells the people who work for the federal government what to do, as a practical matter, it also encouraged, motivated private businesses to establish these affirmative action programs because these private businesses wanted to have the federal government as a customer. So the executive order, even though it only affects what the federal government does, it motivated other parts of the economy to get into line with that expectation. So this can be a pretty significant economic and legal tool for the chief executive to use. Then we have administrative law. Another term for this is regulatory law, regulations. These are going to seem like statutes in many senses. They have many things in common with statutes, but we'll talk about some distinctions that they have. Finally, we're going to talk about the laws of other countries as well as the concept of international law. My guess is that you're going to be surprised how international law isn't what you think it is. But we'll save that to the very end. We don't spend a lot of time on international law in this course. Some topics to think about are, why do societies have laws? What risks and benefits do laws present? And what do we mean when we say law? Those are some ideas I'd like for you to think about. We'll talk about some of these ideas in more detail in class time. Along the line of what is law, let's look at some definitions. This first definition here, this first element you would find in the textbook. What is the law? It's a body of rules of conduct established and enforced by the controlling authority of a society. And of course, the controlling authority of a society is just a fancy word for the government. And of course, all countries have laws. The laws may be well thought out, wise, fair, laws, or they may be tyrannical laws that are very unfair. The Nazi Germany had laws. I'm sure they had some good laws, like don't kill people, but they had some very, very bad and evil laws that were not good ideas. So laws can be good, laws can be bad, but I think we all agree that we need to have laws. Otherwise, we'd have anarchy. Anarchy is kind of the condition where there isn't law, or at least if there are laws, they are not enforced and they are not followed by the population. You can think about anarchy being a situation in which the society has collapsed, where the rule of law is no longer in effect. Perhaps there's no police force, there's no centralized government, there are no checks on the power of individuals. So perhaps the powerful folks, the people that have weapons and are physically strong and have assets, can exert that power to the detriment of people that aren't in that position. You can imagine for a second that if we had anarchy, you wouldn't have been able to get to school, to go to class, because you might have been subject to highway robbery if you had left your home. You might have found that someone would just, when you were stopped at the red light, carjack you and take your car from you. Or if you had stopped at the red light, you might find, well, nobody else is stopping and everybody's hitting your car as you obey the traffic laws. And once you're driving along and you realize you're about to run out of gas, you pull into the gas station. Well, you may see that people are stealing gas; they're not paying for it, and so obviously the gas station, once it runs out of gas, it's not going to get more gas, because why should it fill the gas tanks to just have that asset being stolen? So pretty soon there wouldn't be enough gas; people wouldn't be able to drive their cars, and there would be people maintaining the roads, and so as you can see, kind of the society would fall apart. So we need to have rules, even though many times we may not agree with all the rules. The general concept of rules is an important one, to have stability, to have predictability, and to have continuity. Imagine for a second that you and I entered into a contract, and the agreement was that you have a widget factory, and you're going to provide me with 1,000 widgets in 6 months, and at that time, I am going to pay you $10,000. But the widgets that you're going to make for me are specialized. I want some special features on my widgets. I want them to be green widgets, and most people prefer that the widgets be black, and so my decision to want a green widget means that if something falls through with our deal, you're going to have a hard time unloading these on somebody else. So anyway, we enter into a contract, we sign it, and we're ready to go. And so you go back to your factory and you start making some widgets. And 6 months later, you show up, you knock on my door and say, hey, I've got your 1,000 widgets. And I say, oh, I changed my mind. I don't want them anymore. Well, you say, but I spent a lot of money making these widgets. I had to hire workers. I had to buy raw materials. I had to use power. I turned down other contracts where I could have made money so I could make your widgets, and you need to pay me $10,000 for them. And I say, no, thanks. I don't really want them anymore. I decided to go out of that business. Well, you'd sue me, of course. You'd say, you know what, we had a contract, and I followed my terms, and so guess what? You need to follow yours. And so that is what we have with the law, with the system of laws. If I make a promise, in the vast, vast majority of cases, I'm going to be bound by it. But let's imagine a society in which I could change my mind with impunity. Well, then you consider those circumstances. Would you be motivated to actually fulfill the terms of your contract? You have 6 months to build these widgets, but you're sitting back there thinking, well, gee whiz, maybe she'll change her mind, and I'll be stuck with 1,000 widgets I can't sell, and I will have spent all that money. So very likely you would say, you know what, I'm not actually going to enter into that specialized contract for the green widgets. Maybe I'll make some black widgets. It seems like I can sell those pretty easily to people. As I make them, I just sell them, and it seems to work out okay, but I'm certainly not going to custom make anything. I'm certainly not going to do something that undermines my situation because I can't enforce the terms of the contract. Well, you can see when you don't have the ability to enforce the terms of the contract, you're going to really negatively affect the economic viability of the society. But laws do more than just create stability, predictability, and continuity. They also inform the citizens about what their rights are and what their obligations are. So it tells citizens things like you have the right to engage in free speech. You have the right to vote. You have the right to be involved in the economy by employment. But you also have obligations. You have to pay taxes. You have to send your children to school. You have to perhaps serve in the military for some period of time. These types of ideas. And informing the citizens of that is important because in many cases, the average ordinary citizen, assuming that the rights are reasonable and the obligations are reasonable, the average citizen is going to say, you know what, I'm part of the society. I'm willing to do my fair share. And so most people are going to go along with that program. But, of course, you need to have consequences in the event somebody chooses not to. If I choose not to pay my taxes, maybe I'm one of those people that doesn't play by the rules. Well, it's important that I be informed of what's going to happen to me. If I'm caught, am I going to go to prison? Or if I dodge the draft, am I going to go to prison or perhaps executed for my failure? So I need to know the consequences because that's going to help me decide whether I'm going to fulfill my obligation or not. Okay, so here are the categories, not all exhaustive list of categories, but here are some big categories for primary sources of law. This is an important idea, primary sources of law. You will definitely see this going forward, and it's, of course, in contrast to secondary sources of law. Excuse me. When we talk about primary sources of law, really we're talking about what you and I mean when we say the law. Things like statutes, things like regulations, things like constitutions, things like those cases that the judges come down with. These are what we think of when we think about the law. The legislature creates the law. The administrative agency writes regulations that apply develop more specific features of the statute, and then the judges come through and interpret the statute, the regulation, perhaps the Constitution, to create the law. All of these things are primary sources of law. You can see they all have a characteristic word. Someone in the government who has the authority says you've got to do X or you can't do X or you get to do X. That's what a primary source of law is. A secondary source of law we really don't think of so much as the law. But in this, for the purposes of this course and for really all legal courses, you will think of these as secondary sources of law. These sources are descriptions of the law. They are finding aids, called descriptions. These are finding aids for finding the law. These are explanations or examples of the law. So what the best secondary sources do is point the reader to the primary sources. For the most part, secondary sources are not. I'm going to clear this. I'm going to, if I can. If I can actually make it erase. Doesn't look like I can. Oh, here we go. Okay, I did make it erase. Okay. So secondary sources are usually created by private citizens. So it's not the government. The government can tell you what to do, but I, your next door neighbor, can suggest that you do things, but I don't have the capacity to lock you up if you don't do it. So created by private citizens. So the quality of secondary sources is very contingent upon how well they do describing the primary sources. So think about your textbook for a second. The person who wrote your textbook is a private citizen, or a few private citizens. If they were to sit back and completely misdescribe, erroneously describe some aspect of the law, they don't change the law. They just mess up and do a bad job. And maybe you'll learn the law incorrectly, but they don't have the capacity to change, for example, the Constitution. If they make an error and say that everybody has the right to vote, even if you're under the age of 18, they don't somehow give the right to vote to people under the age of 18. So the pronouncements made in secondary sources are only helpful insofar as they accurately describe what the related primary source is. Here are some examples of secondary sources. Legal encyclopedias. And a legal encyclopedia works just like the books that you might have had in your house growing up. You might not. You may be too young to know this. But there used to be volumes of books in many Americans' households. A popular one was Encyclopedia Britannica, Encyclopedia Americana. There were lots of different ones. Anyway, you'd have one volume that was called, A, and there'd be B, then there would be C, and it would go on all the way to, X, Y, Z. Maybe it was one big volume. And so if you were looking for information about aardvarks in the encyclopedia, you'd go to A. And also in that book, you'd find abacuses. If you were interested in learning about bananas, you'd go to B. If you were interested in finding out about xylophones or zebras or yo-yos, you'd go to this one. Then once you got to the aardvark article, you'd typically find a reasonably short article that would probably show you a picture of an aardvark, maybe a map of where aardvarks live. You would list some statistics, maybe life expectancy, what they eat, what type of animal are they? Are they a mammal? Or what their markings are, how much they weigh, how long they are, do they live in herds or individual families, or all those types of issues. And then there would probably be a short article about it. Now, it wouldn't be the type of article that would somehow make you the world's greatest expert on aardvarks. They're usually written for, say, elementary or middle school level of understanding. If you really want a deep understanding of aardvarks, you're going to have to go to other resources. Then at the end of the article, they might refer you to some additional resources that would be useful. But let's say that when you got to, say you wanted to learn about an abacus, and so you went to the part of the book that would have the word abacus in it, and you didn't find anything there. Well, there might be a cross-reference that would point you to maybe computer. So you might have to go to the C volume then. Or perhaps you'd go to the index. Maybe the last book in the series was an index. And so you could look up the topic of abacus and find, abacus is in the computer section. And so then you can look about abacuses. Well, all of these features are the same things that we see with legal encyclopedias. Obviously, the topics aren't aardvarks and abacuses, or computers, or xylophones. They are legal terms. So in your first volume here, you might find abandoned property. Under B, you might find British law. Under C, you might find codes. Just some examples. Maybe under F, you'd find family law. Under C, you might find contract law or criminal law. Under N, you might find a section on murder. those types of things. And so they give you typically an introduction to the topic. They will show you other resources that you can find in this area. But they themselves don't create law. They can't change the law. They can just point you to the statutes and the cases that talk about these resources. In addition to encyclopedias, there's also things called treatises. A treatise is really just a book. It can be more than one book. It could be like, say, a 2 or 3 volume set that discuss an issue. And again, the value of treatises are only as valuable, I guess, as what the information is included in it. Some treatises are so highly, highly regarded in legal business that they have virtually the force of law. An example of that is Prosser on torts. Mr. Prosser was a very famous law professor, and he's now passed away, but his book, Prosser on Torts, is the go-to book for law students who want to learn about torts. And even outside of law school, people who are writing briefs, for example, will oftentimes refer to Prosser on Torts. But if I, Cynthia Groover, were to write a book on torts called Groover on Torts, guess what? People would not be flocking to buy it because who's this Groover chick? Why is she writing a book on torts? Now, once I wrote it and it became well-regarded and well-reviewed, and people said, oh, yes, Groover has some very interesting insights that really describe the law in a very, very effective way, I might become the next Prosser on torts. But it's only because of the strength of the arguments, the strength of the research that I did, that my reputation as an author of a treatise or a hornbook would grow. There are lots of areas of the law where if you practice in it, you will have a go-to hornbook or go-to treatise that you'll go to. For example, I practiced in employment law. I'm going to erase all these things. And one of the go-to books in my discipline was called Schley and Grossman. Many times in legal writing, the authors' names are the key ones you go to. I think everyone calls it Schley and Grossman, but I think it's called something like employment law, but I'm not even sure the title. They're Forest Green books. I think they're a 3-volume set with lots of additional volumes, paperback volumes that are included in it too. So that's something like this. But anyway, everyone calls it Schley and Grossman, the authors' names. And the other disciplines will have their own treatises or their own hornbooks. But these are really anything that describes a particular subject of law. Your textbooks that you'll have in the paralegal program are treatises, the particular books that you use in your practice that aren't the law themselves, but maybe describe or explain the law or give you examples of how to apply the law. Those are going to be treatises and hornbooks. Then we have law review articles. A law review is a publication typically associated with the law school. Historically, law schools had one law review, or what's called a law journal. And to get onto the law review was a very prestigious thing to accomplish. There's two ways traditionally to get onto the law review, and usually you got on at the end of your first year of law school, and you continued working on that law review for your second and third year. So during your first year of law school, if you did very, very well in your grades, you could grade on to law school is what it's called. You would be invited simply because of the very impressive grades that you accomplished in law school. And so a portion of the people who were on law review graded on. Another way to get onto law review is to write on. After the end of the first year, you would be invited. Some law schools would allow everyone to do it. Some law schools would invite certain people who didn't get quite good enough grades to grade on but still had impressive grades. And they would be given the option to write a comment or a note, an example writing to show kind of their stuff. And then they would be chosen based upon a combination of their grades and that writing sample, and that would be another way they could get onto the law review. And once they were on the law review, then they would have the role of editing and selecting articles to be in that particular law school's law review. It's a very prestigious thing. To get on the law review definitely opens up a lot of career opportunities. And so in most law schools, it's a very highly sought after honor. The flip side of it is, though, it's a lot of work. The head position in law review is to be the president of law review. President Obama, for example, was the president of the Law Review of Harvard, the Harvard Law Review, which is one of the most well-regarded. So that's an example of, obviously he didn't become president simply because he was on the President Law Review, but that was a step in his legal career. Large law schools oftentimes will have their premier law review or law journal, but they'll also have additional ones that maybe cover specific topics. For example, health law or immigration law or criminal law or environmental law, those types of topics. These can be very useful career tools, especially if you're planning on practicing in the particular area that the journal covers. Usually they're not selected, though. Anyone who wants to work on those journals has the opportunity. So they usually aren't as helpful in advancing your career goals as other things. But anyway, these law reviews, whether it's a prestigious one or one of the other publications from the law school, are readily available in the legal environment. In fact, Westlaw and Lexis and other publications will carry these law review articles, and they can be an important research tool that you will be using in your legal career. You can cite them to courts to let them know information about where the law is developing in a particular area. Again, though, the quality of the law review article is only as good as how well it describes the sources of information. So if the law review article misquotes statutes and misdescribes aspects of the law, it doesn't change the law. It's just done a bad job of describing the law. Then you have compilations of the law, which is really, well, here we're probably talking about digests, would be my guess what I'm focusing here on. And digests are a tremendously helpful resource. Go back to the cases. We have all these cases. Well, the way cases are organized are not thematically. On Monday, a decision is published about capital murder. On Tuesday, a decision is published about income tax law. On Wednesday, a decision is published about contract, breach of contract. On Thursday, a case is published about a dog bite case. On Friday, a case is published about divorce. And that's the order that they're going to appear in the published reporters, is what they're called. The case law is published in what's called reporters. So you can see if you are really interested in researching dog bite law, you would have to read hundreds of cases probably before you came across your first dog bite case. You'd have to see, oh, that's a murder case, has nothing to do with dog bite. Oh, that's a tax case, has nothing to do with dog bite. Oh, that's a car accident case, has nothing to do with dog bite. And so you'd find that it would take you a very, very long time to find the dog bite cases. Well, that's not a very efficient process. So these digests, these compilations of law will tell you, hey, here's all the dog bite cases. Go to this volume on this page, and there's a good dog bite case. Oh, and if you go to this other volume on this other page, you can find more dog bite cases. And these digests don't really tell you what to think about these cases. It just tells you where to find them and what the topic is. But you can see helping you find the primary source of law is a very important aspect of secondary sources. It's more important with case law than anything else because case law is pretty unwieldy to find on your own. Then we have legal dictionaries. I'm going to add to this thesauri. Of course, thesauri are thesauruses, you can also call, are resources that help you find synonyms. This should be a U. Sorry for that. Legal dictionary is just like any other dictionary. It lists a legal term. It gives you some aid in pronouncing it. It tells you what part of speech it is, and then it's going to define the term. It may help you with usage by giving you an example of usage, just the same way that you would do other things. And, of course, the most famous legal dictionary is Black's. Black's is kind of like the Webster's dictionary for the law. Another well-regarded one is Ballantyne's. We're fortunate in Texas in that the current editor of Black's is a Dallasite. He is Brian Garner, very well-regarded legal writing guru. He's just published a book with, that should be an R-N-E-R. So it's G-A-R-N-E-R. He's just published a book with Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia about legal writing, very well-regarded writer. And we'll be talking about some of his ideas about legal writing when we get to Chapter 8 in this textbook. But these are just some examples. Now, Black's Law Dictionary is quite expensive. I am not recommending that you go out and buy it. Even Valentine's is quite expensive. You probably don't really need any legal dictionary at this point. When you're out there working in industry, you'll find that probably your law firm will provide you with one for no charge. Also, there are online legal dictionaries that you can use, again, for no charge. And your textbooks will oftentimes have an index or other tools to help you find words. So don't invest a lot of money in a legal dictionary. If you happen to be at half-price books and see one for $5 or $10, you may want to choose to invest in it. But right now, at this point in your career, it's not a priority item. But you do need to be aware of how can I find the definition of terms going forward. So another topic to think about is what are the differences between primary and secondary sources of law. We'll talk about this in class in more detail. And we'll talk about whether regulations are primary sources of law, why or why not. I'm going to conclude this lecture at this time. When we next get together, we'll discuss the case law and common law tradition in more details. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.